In this episode, I'm joined by Pepita Hesselberth and Joost de Bloois to discuss their co-edited book, Politics of Withdrawal, Media, Arts, Theory. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast or gain access to some exclusive content, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Okay, so Pepita Hesselberth and Joost de Bloois, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing a book which you both co-edited in 2020, Politics of Withdrawal, Media, Arts, Theory, which was published by Rowman and Littlefield. And this is a book, as people might imagine from the title, to do with withdrawal, with exit, with strike, with radical notions of leaving behind, or the possibility, whether or not it's actually possible to retreat from certain structures we've made, primarily focusing on academia. And this is a pretty big subject of the day of what the future of academia is really going to look like. And that in itself is defining what we mean when we say academia, because it's quite a loose term. But yeah, before we jump in with the book, I mean, just tell us a little bit about yourselves and how this fairly unique book came about.
About ourselves. I'm Pepita Hesselberth. I'm a media scholar by background. I probably get around to myself while talking about the book because it's so entrenched with our own research, and the same goes for Joost, I suppose. First of all, thanks for having us. We're delighted to be here. The book came out of a small conference we organized on disconnection withdrawal in Copenhagen in 2018, but it really has its root in our own research. In my case, again, I'm a media scholar, so I worked on a project called Disconnectivity in the Digital Age at the University of Copenhagen between 15 and 18. And my aim really there was to develop a conceptual framework for understanding the cultural and social political implications of voluntary disconnectivity. There was a lot of talk about involuntary disconnectivity, but I was interested in people voluntarily disconnecting from media use, but more interested perhaps more broadly in the kind of psychic, socioeconomic and political withdrawal from mainstream forms of connectivity. I was kind of intrigued also by the surge of people leaving Facebook at the time, right? It's abandoning their iPhones, going on mindfulness retreats, resigning, searching for alternative modes of living, myself included, I suppose. But I felt helped by the debates in media studies, which are mostly on media avoidance, media refusal, which was the point where I started to work together with Joost. Is much more interested in political theory and withdrawal throughout his writings. And what I realized was that despite all of the public expressions of exiting and withdrawing, what started to matter most for me was the gesture of withdrawing. Even if it was publicly addressed, it's not necessarily what the gesture of withdrawing doesn't necessarily take on the form of language or expression. It can also transpire in silence, an experiment in action, in the kind of different kinds of presence that are generated, alternative ways of being with other people, being in society, however momentarily, right?
Yeah. So my name is Joost de Bloois. So I teach cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, which is basically like a local variant of cultural studies. I have a background in philosophy and literary studies, and I originally had an interest and still have an interest in, I guess you could call it anti-economic thought. So I did my PhD on the notion of general economy in Georges Bataille and Jacques Derrida. And I sort of retained this interest in theories of expenditure, destitution. So from Bataille to Klossowski to Agamben. And about 10 years ago, when everyone got interested in sort of autonomist, Italian autonomism, I also jumped on that bandwagon. And I saw a lot of similarities between sort of the Bataillean notions of expenditure and Italian refusal of labor, anti-work, etc. And that combined well with another long-standing interest of mine, which is situationism, so the French sort of post-war avant-garde. So a lot of these things come together, I think, in the notion of withdrawal as a refusal, basically, of the economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you, are either of you, do you sympathize personally with academic withdrawal?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think Joost as well. And that's, of course, always the question, do we withdraw from the university or within the university? We'll get to talk about this, no doubt. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good, that's it's a tough line to walk. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that difficult question. But before we do so, I have to ask you both the Hermitix question, which I've reduced down. It's usually 3, but if you could both place 2 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and then listen in on the conversation then of this 4. So I think you said you scripted this together, so perhaps there is some coherence. But who are these?
Not at all.
2 and 2? No, who are these 2 and 2 who are entering into this room?
I mean, it would be fascinating to have all 4 of them, I guess, have a conversation. But no, I mean, the 2 that I came up with almost immediately, right, were 2 radical thinkers. So Pier Paolo Pasolini on the one hand, and Guy Debord on the other hand, because it seems to me that we kind of live in a world that they predicted. So Pasolini speaks of the anarchy of power, which he relates to like the absolute sovereignty of capital. He even speaks of an anthropological mutation that came about through consumerism. And both speak, I think, very much about, I guess, what you could call the disappearance of lived experience in a way. Mm-hmm. And they were both, I think, engaged in forms of withdrawal in their own way. So both, I mean, interestingly, I think, moved away from more traditional forms of Marxist thinking. So they both started out as Marxist and then moved into something quite different, I think, although Debord, for example, never really negated his Marxism. But they were both interested, I think, in new alternatives to, say, capitalism in terms of new forms of life, new forms of living. And what I also think is really, really interesting, or what I would like to know, right, if I could speak to them in a sense, is where they would situate themselves politically at the moment, because it seems to me that both of them in the 1970s, and Pasolini, of course, unfortunately, right, died or was assassinated in 75, but Debord certainly in the 1970s made a kind of radical turn, I think, in his thinking, but also in his activism. So he literally withdrew into the French countryside, started to write autobiographical texts, and basically proposed his, I don't know, sense of grand living, this form of like grand living as the alternative to capitalism, which also has a certain conservative side to it as well. I mean, for Debord, the alternative to contemporary consumerist living or highly technological living would be to hark back to the Baroque. He started to translate Spanish poetry and what have you got. And I think that's really interesting. So where would they have ended up in a sense? And also in Pasolini, right, there is this sort of romanticization of popular culture, even a kind of like eroticization of popular culture. And I think it's really interesting to see if they would have ended up in this, I don't know, expanding gray zone that we see today, somewhere in between the traditional left and the traditional, more conservative right. I think that would be a fascinating conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pepita, who is now entering this room, I know you didn't form this as a 4, but...
Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, and Lauren Berlant, a radical feminist cultural theorist. I think I'm more opportunistic in assembling my table. I think both would have challenged my own thinking for most, because their thinking is so differently from mine, and they've inspired me greatly throughout this project. So. Mm-hmm. I probably think they wouldn't say so much, but we never know.
There's something. I think maybe there is a thread there. I mean, with respect to, I'll try draw it out. I mean, it might be a complete failure, but Pasolini and Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, with respect to the idea of being present, just to be present. I think famously, of course, with Pasolini of 120 Days of Salo, and the fact that the despite the visceral horrors of that film, the thing, I think the reason it sticks with so many people is it's filmed in such a way that it's like excessively banal. It's just horribly mundane, and you just want it. You want it over, not because of the horror, but because it's like this is sort of almost hyper boring. How have you made such horrible things just like a family holiday film, badly filmed or something like that. So with respect to, I guess, to Pasolini, the idea of trying to withdraw from that sense of the world it has no like shocks anymore, that it's become this like flat line. And I guess with Thich Nhat Hanh, it's like, well, you need to be present within that moment. So maybe there'd be a question there of what is it to be present within a time that just never seems to change?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess the big question then with these, I mean, we'll probably draw in these thinkers, but I mean, what is it to withdraw? What does withdrawal mean?
The book is called Politics of Withdrawal, and really the starting point was these increased phenomena of withdrawal as in contemporary society and in political theory. So there's a resonance between what we now call the quiet quitters, between the leaving academia debate, between digital detoxes and more explicitly political takes on withdrawal and political gestures, such as the ZAD, the French movement, the far right and far left rejections of modernity, the theories of refusal, exodus and desertion, inoperativity and sabotage. These are terms that recur in political theory, but also all sorts of populist as well as Silicon Valley discourses and politics, such as Brexit, Elon Musk, who goes to Mars, right? And we're wondering if there's a common denominator to all of these things, and whether that common denominator could be considered political. In short, we define withdrawal as a form of political disengagement, or a politics through disengagement, which is much of a paradox, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to say, right, that withdrawal is always purely negative. So, I mean, there is obviously an element of refusal, of breaking away, as you also said in your introduction, but it doesn't remain within that moment, I'd say. So I think what was important for us is that withdrawal always seems to tap into potential. So it's, in that sense, it's not a political program. So there is no clear goal, but it's more of a gesture that opens up political potential or personal potential, right? So in that sense, it's not a political program. It's also not necessarily, it doesn't always necessarily proceed from, say, a clear-cut decision. It's not always rooted in some kind of will. I mean, often we withdraw because we can no longer bear the current situation. It's more a matter of what Roland Barthes calls wariness. So we're wary of the current situation. We're oversaturated with the pressures of academia, for example, and that's why we quit. That's why we withdraw. So in that sense, it's political in a sense that it's a refusal of the status quo in search of a new life, in search of a new form of life, collective or personal. But it's not, say, grand politics. It's not the politics of confrontation, so to speak. I think this was also important for us. We went to look for thinkers that helped us to conceptualize politics, not in terms of struggle or pure opposition, so to speak. But in that sense, right, it's the lines between, in withdrawal, the lines between, say, the political and the non-political, so the social, the cultural, even the personal, even the religious, so to speak, are often blurred. To withdraw from whatever academia can be a personal choice to preserve your mental health, for example, or your ethical standards, but it's also a political gesture at the same time, because it's also a kind of refusal of the current system. So I think that in that sense, withdrawal, but in that sense, I think withdrawal is also fits the contemporary moment, where politics as this sort of separate domain, so to speak, with its own institutions and its own rituals, etc., parliament, you name it, is also beginning to blur in that sense, and overlaps more and more with, ethical questions, religious questions, purely economic questions, etc. So I think in that sense that with withdrawal, we can also understand this, expanding of the domain of politics into, figures like the cabin or the shelter, for example, perhaps up to the point where it is no longer politics, so to say.
Do you think that's one of the difficulties of withdrawal, is that what people are collectively, individually, but collectively withdrawing from? There's this atmosphere of withdrawal. Is the problem that we can't really define what exactly it is that we're exiting from. We can't say, well, I'm leaving a feudalist state, I'm seceding from the monarchy or something like that, that everything's so loose that it's quite difficult to withdraw because you can't exactly pinpoint what it is that's stressful, upsetting, annoying, oppressive. It's quite difficult to point. But do you think there is a thread between all these different types of withdrawal, the same sort of atmosphere that people are saying we've had enough of?
I think it's really important, actually, what you say. And we've just did a class on withdrawal, on the politics of withdrawal, and some of the students got really confused by this. Okay, what are we withdrawing from? Because if I'm withdrawing from, media use to be more connected to my daily environment, then it's a form of connecting as well, instead of just disconnecting. So, but it's very important to be very specific on. I think actually it's important to specify what you desire to disconnect from or withdraw from. And it can be very different things, but I think the common denominator is that it's the gesture is the same. And the gesture is the political movement. It's like, I've had enough. I want to move away from this, or get rid of this in my life. Or so it's the gesture, even if it's not acted upon, even if it's not if it's impossible to actually stop using phones or completely withdraw into nature, which is of course also a romanticized idea of what culture and nature can be. But the gesture itself is the political movement. So whatever it is that you're withdrawing from or seek to withdraw from.
Joost, would you agree?
Yeah, and I also think that, so I totally agree with Peter, right? The emphasis is very much on the gesture, so the moment itself of withdrawal, the moment of the breaking away, so to speak. But I think there might also be a common denominator in terms of from what we are withdrawing. I think that withdrawal in that sense is specifically, I don't know, like a contemporary or a late modern phenomenon. So in the introduction to the book, we do refer to Roland Barthes and Foucault, who give, say, historical examples of withdrawal. So Foucault speaks in his text on Parrhesia, on Speaking Truth to Power. He speaks of the otium of the Roman emperors who withdraw to their villas in the hills, above Rome, to reflect on their position in life and politics, etc. So that's an early form of withdrawal, and Barthes is really interested in the more religious forms of withdrawal, so ascesis and anachoresis, etc. But I think that in the book, the examples used are almost all of them are sort of like late modern examples, and I think that has to do a lot with the fact that I think it has to do with what the Italian autonomists would call like real subsumption, right? The fact that every aspect of modern life is mobilized in the service of capital, so to speak. And there's many ways, right, of withdrawing from that. So this can be a kind of, I don't know, like romantic refusal. It can be a sort of, Marxist autonomist refusal of labor, or claiming the right to laziness, for example. But it can also be, ditching your smartphone, or, signing up for a yoga retreat, etc. And the environmental movement, right, I think is also a good example of this, of trying to withdraw from this sort of like mobilization, also of natural resources, right, in the service of capital. So in that sense, it's a kind of response, I would say, to some form or other of being always available, of being, turned into a resource also as a human subject. So I think it is quite closely related to contemporary forms of labor in that sense, and also the, say, contemporary atomization of labor, in which we're all supposed to be these, competitors competing against one another, but also supposed to be, like self-entrepreneurs, which can lead to both, like self-optimization and self-precarization. And I think a lot of these phenomena of withdrawal are kind of responses to that. And yeah, if you look at figures like Pascal Chabot, for example, a Belgian philosopher, who wrote a book called Global Burnout, or Byung-Chul Han on the Burnout Society, I think they see burnout, which we very much look at in terms of withdrawal as a form of resistance against what Han would call the performance society, or Jonathan Crary speaks of like the 24/7 capital. I mean, this doesn't mean. I think that withdrawal by definition would be anti-capitalist or anti-modern even. I mean, it can be. So there are figures like Paul Kingsnorth, for example, who I think was also on your show, who kind of move into this direction of anti-modernity, anti-technology, harking back to whatever figures like Jacques Ellul, for example. And there's a little bit of that in people like thinkers like Bernard Stiegler, who's in our book as well. And again, the environmental movement, I think, also tends towards the sort of more anti-technological, anti-modern side of things. But I think but it doesn't have to be. I think it can also be this moment, again, this sort of gesture of rupture to, recalibrate a relation with modernity or with technology, for example.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it brings about one of the sort of the key problems, I guess, of withdrawal in general, especially within a capitalist world. You mentioned there everyone, everything in service of capital, and capitalism basically being this infinitely malleable thing, which if you don't keep your eye on it, will take whatever it wants under its own name. And I think, to draw in someone like Deleuze, who says anti-production is also production. And next thing you know, you're sort of caught up back in the machine. And I think, of movements such as like the van dwelling movement, who now film their ongoings and put it on YouTube to sort of monetize it. And next thing you know, it's become a lifestyle. And now you've sort of lost the kernel of what really was there altogether. So do you, in that sense, it seems that what we're withdrawing, many of the quote unquote institutions that we're withdrawing from, are almost like gaslighting us into narcissism. You bring in narcissism as well, and the narcissism of academia, but almost like lying to us in the sense of this false sense of security. So in that sense, do you think withdrawal, basically, once again, to draw in Deleuze, has to become nomadic? Like once you do it, you can't really stop, because you'll get caught in a capitalism will catch you out.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, but it's also, we also had this discussion in the class we were teaching with our students. In principle, what anything can be appropriated, right? So anything. As you said, like the genius of capitalism is that it's infinitely malleable, and it can turn anything into its opposite, right? It can turn anything into gold, or into anything can be monetized. That's not necessarily a reason to not try, right? But also, I think there's also, maybe an intellectual element to that argument. It's also a kind of, like gotcha argument that you can also apply like indefinitely in a sense. And I think that withdrawal is at least an attempt to sort of also move away from that argument in a way, to at least explore or experiment with alternatives, even momentarily. But I think it's an interesting thought, right? That withdrawal is, once you engage in withdrawal, you never stop to withdraw. Like you cannot remain indefinitely in that sense into the cabin that you withdraw into, right? Or maybe that's a question. I don't know.
I think it's always, for me, I think it has also affected the way I do academia, because I also felt kind of disappointed by radical left theory that always ends up with, haha, but capitalism has caught up with your radical idea. So my writing has gone more and more, not necessarily anti-theoretical, but I people would call it empiricist. I don't know. I write more about the experiential domain, where I suppose withdrawal can be, even a yoga retreat that is fully commercialized and fully taps into the logic of productivity and becoming a better laborer, can be a genuine experience for someone, and someone can get something out of it that does change something in their lives. And I think there's always a double bind. It's always the paradox. Capitalism will catch up on us, but
But that's sort of the now steadily becoming extremely famous capitalist realism by Mark Fisher. I mean, there's pretty clear limits to that book in terms of, well, okay, but I've still got to live.
Exactly.
And you both seem fairly optimistic about this whole thing, that there is these possibilities. So maybe a question would be like, how... It's a pretty elusive question, and I apologize because I know I'm going off script and I know you've put these answers, but how would you define a successful withdrawal? What does that look like?
I think it really starts with the okay. So when I started doing my research and I got rid of my phone and I've done all these kind of things, and I have one again because I couldn't travel. But I think it was my parents who told me. But I know no one who's so connected as you are. Because you're always obsessed with disconnecting. So I think it starts with the becoming aware of the desire to withdraw from something that is not healthy for you, that is unwholesome. And the awareness, that moment of awareness, that's for me, that's it. It's that tipping point of becoming aware that something is unwholesome, and regardless of what you do with it.
Would you say academia has become unwholesome?
Yes. A very clear answer on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there are different ways of withdrawing in that sense from academia, right? So I agree that there is something very similar, between whatever Pepita's relation with her smartphone and our collective relation to the institution of the university. Yeah. But I think we can maybe deal with it in similar ways, right? I mean, part of it is to become aware of how unwholesome, as you said, that relation is. I think to become aware of that is already an important step, to sort of to no longer buy into the narrative, so to say. I think I think withdrawal has a lot to do with sort of delegitimizing things. So you withdraw because you can no longer accept the status quo, because your own values no longer align with the values of the institution. So there is an aspect of like delegitimizing whatever it is that you withdraw from. And I think that is important also in relation to the university, that it is important to no longer sort of continue to collectively legitimize the current practices within academia, and we still do that massively, partly because of the narcissism that you mentioned, because we are so invested, like not just intellectually, but also like libidinally, if you like subjectively, into the institution. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe a starting point for a successful withdrawal is not so much like literally slamming the door behind you and looking for a new job, but to start with this kind of awareness, and also I think stepping away from this dominant narrative, perhaps also stepping away from the dominant subjectivity that comes with being an academic.
It's interesting you mentioned the status quo there, because in withdrawing from the status quo, do you feel that it's the status quo that you've withdrawn from is the force which makes you feel like you need to then quickly fill that space and define the values, whereas withdrawal itself on an individual or as a collective level, you shouldn't really feel this need, if you leave the status quo, to immediately have some sort of new value system, that it's fine to be in some elusive space. And that's probably what's holding a lot of people back, is they just fall from camp to camp in sort of a ongoing mimesis or something like that.
Mm-hmm. This is a good observation. Very little to add there. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, there is, of course, on the one hand, there's an economic need to fill the gap. So in that sense, very few people can actually afford to remain in limbo in that sense. But you're absolutely right in saying that, this especially, I think, applies to academics, leaving. I mean, this is, of course, Pepita's area more than mine, but I think this especially applies to academics leaving the institution, that they feel genuinely lost because they are so invested in their academic life, and they do feel the need to either continue by different means or to fill that gap immediately. But ideally, I'd say that withdrawal is a kind of like prolonged interruption. It is a suspension. So in that sense, there is no need to immediately fill the gap. But you're absolutely right that we are under a lot of pressure to do exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I, just before I move to the question about sort of the people who believe they truly have or did withdraw, I would be interested just to get your answers of why the reasons as to why you believe so many academics are withdrawing from academia.
I think, so there's two sides to this. There's the public debate. I think academics are trained to express themselves. So there's lots of open resignation letters and so on. There are also many who leave other kinds of jobs. It's just that academics write more about it, perhaps, and feel more, are more entrenched kind of in the academic or the kind of political debates and turn it into aware of the political gesture that it is. But as you probably know, like Harvey and Moten also quite firmly criticized the university, and they're on the Commons. I think they suggest is that there's a strong kinship between, say, the university and other kinds of structures of law and order. They kind of argue that they're listening to the same war of life, of social life. So basically, they suggest that universities, like any other structure of law and order, are there to extract what it can and discard what it doesn't need, right? But they also criticize the critical academic. They say that those who are against the university, they merely affirm it. So even the leaving academia, those who leave academia, and I've read through most of it as Joost, the leaving academia debate. It's very affirmative of what the university could be or should be, or so there's a lot of loathing that happens openly, and to a large extent, it also affirms what the institution stands for. But there's also those who leave without a bang, those who leave silently. And I'm intrigued, and also those who don't leave, because sometimes it's really strange when you read through. I've read through them, and I got reading the Leaving Academia articles. I'm sometimes get really stressed out because of their call to action. Right, there's always this call to action. We should really change things. It should be abandoned. We should destroy it, or what have you. And it's kind of this kind of invigoration that is triggered in leaving, or in the call to leave. There's something strange to it, because if the only logical conclusion to the mounting concerns over labor precarity in academia or elsewhere is to resign, or else become complacent, right, to a system that doesn't work anymore, then we're trapped in a double bind, because you leave one precarious position to become precarious in another way, right? And I've often wondered. I think for me that there's a piece of me in the volume on leaving academia, and my interest there was, I really wondered what a less precarious take on the need to take refuge or withdraw from or in academia might entail, other than, say, speaking out by quitting, which still boils down to depriving oneself of one's source and often joy of livelihood. And I think also we shouldn't forget that many of us chose to work in the university also to escape from the status quo, to enter a safe space for thinking radical thoughts, for being with students, or being in life differently, right? To allow for radical feminists, radical race, radical what have you thinking. And then, of course, I also wonder to what extent a politics of withdrawal is still possible within the academic context at all, especially since writing about withdrawal politically so clearly at odds with the gesture of withdrawing itself, right? So if you withdraw from being in academia, you also withdraw yourself from the academic debate. And I think there's a strong correspondence between those who leave, who state their leave, and what sociologist Rosalind Gill has called the hidden injuries of neoliberal academia, right? So the affective and body experiences that are familiar to most of us, feelings of exhaustion, precarity, stress, anxiety, overload, anger, shame, competitiveness, grief, guilt, all those feelings that we're burdened by as academics. that are so ordinary and everyday, and it's kind of, she says, it's a stuff that doesn't end up being in a keynote or an open resignation letter, or sometimes it does. But it's more the stuff of the chats in the corridor and the coffee breaks. I think Berlin, to bring in Berlin here, what I take from her is that where she says to complain, right, or to moan or just be unhappy is also a way of bargaining with what is there. So her theory is the theory of the meanwhile, right? So we've left the status quo, or we want to abandon the status quo, but we have no alternative political model to think with yet, or no alternative system yet. So in the meanwhile, we have to bargain with what is there, and it might not. So to complain might not hold a hope for change, but it does give a response to the complaint itself. So whatever hope it instills, it comes from the immediate response you get on the spot. So I think there's a close resemblance between those who stay and complain and those who leave with a bang, right? And I hope.
Yeah. No, I agree with Pepita that I think people leave the university because they feel that a certain kind of promise has been broken in a way. I think academics tend to, they are narcissists, if you like, in Bernard Stiegler's sense of the word. So for him, like, narcissism means that it's not necessarily negative. It's actually quite positive and necessary. He says you need to identify with institutions, with cultural institutions, for example, whatever, with your parents, etc., in order to individuate, to become an individual in a way. So you first need to identify in order to step away from from your parents or from your cultural environment and so on. And I think the university is very good in promising you an identity. It offers you something to identify with. It basically validates your passions, right? It validates your interests, and it validates you in the end. I think it basically says, it basically tells you, university basically tells you, go ahead, follow your passion to be a medievalist or a Lacanian or a post-humanist, etc. It's not just some kind of like weird hobby of yours. Like, you really are like a Lacanian, and we validate it. And that's a very powerful, that's a very powerful drug in a way, right? So this is why academics, libidinally invest so much into their jobs, because they basically invest themselves, right, into the job. And that's why it's so hard to withdraw as well, because you have to disinvest in yourself in a way. That's why they are so happy to put up with so much, self-precarization. In a way. And of course, the neoliberal university is a different beast, right, than the traditional university. So in that sense, it uses this promise to lure you in. But it's not really interested in you and your passions, etc. So as long as you tick off all the boxes, as long as you write your 2 articles a year or whatever, right, you bring in your grant money, which is much more important than the 2 articles, right, then it's happy. So, and I think this discrepancy, if you like, between a promise, a very effective, like emotional almost, appeal, and the reality of the university that's, one type of business among many, is what puts people off. And it's very much a broken promise. It's very much a broken, like, affective promise as well.
Actually, I was thinking it's also interesting to turn this question around and ask you to comment, James, a little bit on your decision to withdraw from academia, or not do the stuff you do within academia, to operate outside of it, in the land of the enemy, if you like. Commerce.
Well, I mean, it will come as no surprise. I mean, one big reason was because of all I was interviewing a lot of PhD students who were coming to the end, and they had their dissertation, which we would then speak about, and every single one of them just said, I'm just exhausted and miserable, and I've just spent 6 years alone in a room staring at the same stuff. And I just thought, well, I don't want to be part of that. And to be honest, I can't think of a single academic, it's all I interview is academics, really. I can't think of a single one who said, like, I really want to be in academia. I mean, they as you said, all of them went in with that promise. And the great irony is that academia very quickly no longer actually allows the enjoyment of the subject you went in for. It's all about a language of what I call like a language of strategy. So it's like attack and defense. Right, we go to the conference and we have to attack or defend something, or you have to go defend your thesis. So it's no longer like we're all just we all just enjoy and are interested in this. Let's sit down and just talk about it. It's always like for some sort of almost like military attack on something, or there has to be these clearly defined reasons, and it takes away that actual interest in it very, very quickly. And I just didn't want to be. I mean, why would you want to be part of that? But that promise still has it's still extremely potent. Like it's an unspoken promise of academia, as you said. Yeah. But there was a great line that you, this is from your own essay in the book, Pepita, the loss of academic spirit has to be accelerated.
I think it's Joost's actually.
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No, it's all right. So it's, you'll happily take up the answer.
How would you accelerate it?
Well, I think it was a paraphrase from the Invisible Committee, right? It's a radical French sort of autonomist collective, and in their latest book, Maintenant, they speak of they reflect on Agamben's notion of destitution. They try to turn it into, say, a practical strategy, practical political strategy. And one of the examples of institutions that need to be destituted that they give is the university. And basically, I mean, the idea essentially is quite simple. I mean, their idea is that the university has been hollowed out like the rest of society, right? Has been hollowed out so much that it has become a kind of like cardboard, like Potemkin village. It's still sort of promises you, right, whatever self-realization and then the pursuit of disinterested knowledge, etc. But in reality, it is this sort of corporate beast and so on. So it is already dead in a way. I think they literally say that at some point, like the university is already dead, and we have to kill it again or something like that. So it's on the tipping point of being dead. We have to give it its final push. So for them, I think withdrawing from the university would be a kind of acceleration, or a weird kind of acceleration, right? That would acceleration through slowing down in a way by through retreating, sabotaging. Etc. I'm not sure if we would necessarily agree with that. So the idea that because it's on the verge of falling apart anyway, we have to give it its final push, or we can just leave it behind us as if it's already dead. Because there's a kind of, I guess in the text, I call it a kind of melancholy to that as well, almost in the Freudian sense, right? So for Freud, mourning in a sense is still positive, like it's a work of mourning, and in the end you end up coming to terms with the loss, whereas melancholy, sort of in melancholy, like the lost object sort of drags you into the depths with you, and I think there is something similar going on in the Invisible Committee, like because the world is already dead, like we might as well just give up on it altogether. But the problem, of course, is like Freud would probably also say, is that leaves you completely empty-handed, and it sort of weirdly repeats the trauma in a way. You basically agree with with the neoliberal wrecking ball in a sense, or rather you kind of acknowledge that it has already won. And that there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that there's another form of withdrawal possible, which is really, as we said, more of an interruption, and which can be literally leaving academia, but not because you think the institution is already dead, but because you kind of mourn the untapped potential, so to speak, and because you withdraw because you want to revitalize that potential. So not to accelerate the destruction in a way, but because you regret the destruction, even if you can't stop the actual destruction. So I think withdrawal can also be a kind of momentary interruption to regain a certain potential again, which would be actually much closer to Agamben's notion of destitution, for example. So I think we're a little bit skeptical about accelerating loss or accelerating the destruction of institutions.
There's a beautiful piece by Sarah Sharma in a volume called Staying Power. It's too much fantasizing about exiting, she argues, and quite convincing in our view. And she proposes care as the opposing political force to the exit. So there's another way of going about this, is to care. And she says it kind of care is that which responds to the uncompromisingly tethered nature of our human dependency and the contingency of life, right? The mutual precariousness of the human condition. And this is where she sees the task of critical theory in exit times. When it seems that culturally and theoretically everyone is making an exit plan from the far right to the far left, right? There are warring fractions that are all trying to get out of the door first. Exit on the right, imagined as a kind of a mechanism of establishing sovereignty, while exit on the left is kind of a refusal oriented autonomy, right? So, and she writes, it would seem that the book, it's the closing, it's a coda of the book. On Politics of Withdrawal is actually a book about the politics of having a staying power to take up directly the insidious nature of that which cannot be withdrawn from on an individual basis. So if we withdraw, I've just read Shiva's book on soil, not oil. If we withdraw, it would have to be a collective decision on organizing our society differently, to have a different way of, what is it called? A basic income, a more investment in soil and not oil, and so on. These decisions can be made, but they can only be made if we, as a human species, decide to turn our predicament. So we have to stay with the trouble somehow.
I mean, that sort of has a focus on withdrawal being it almost has to be, in some sense, a collective thing. So the question I had with regards to, this idea of like individualistic frontier withdrawal has been throughout history, and it seems to be a very clear difference. So we have people like Ted Kaczynski. I guess we could go all the way back to Thoreau, though Thoreau is a bit more sensible. And then you have the primitivists such as John Zerzan, but you have people who basically are going back a little bit, putting down a flag, drawing a box and saying like, we should have never left this box. And that seems to be one, individualistic to the point of sort of a real dangerous ignorance, but also like, as you're saying about the staying power, it's almost and the idea of care, it's almost like saying, well, yeah, it's all very well and good withdrawing, but we still have to be humans to each other when we get there. If we're just radical for its own sake, then we're going to get there and it's almost going to be quite chaotic. So, I mean, do you see a danger in that very boisterous form of frontier exit?
Yeah, I've always been interested in the tipping points, right? The kind of moment when a sense of empowerment turns into its opposite, disempowerment, vice versa, when disempowerment is transformed into an instrument of empowerment, which also may help to shed light on the disconnect that arguably precedes extremism. One of the founding texts for me. So for me, says Anne Kaczynski, what goes wrong is not necessarily the thinking or the gesture, but the action that is attached to it. A founding text for me that triggered my interest in the topic was Murakami's Underground. It's a collection of two books. They were originally published, I think, in 1979. 1997, 1998. It's comprised of interviews of the victims of the 1995 sarin attacks in the Tokyo subway, as well as a number of interviews with the former members of the cult that was held accountable for the attack. And it's a really interesting read. The cult is called Aum Shinrikyo. It was led by a charismatic guru called Shoko Asahara. And I was initially intrigued by the book of the topic of the book and Murakami's introduction, in which he reflects on the role of the media during and in the aftermath of the attack. But I soon found out that the cult, whose name I should have given a hint, I suppose, had its start in a yoga and meditation class, and most of the members of the cult were recruited at the Shambhala or the dojo where they practiced, as well as at some of the top universities of the country. And this really upset me while reading this. I was reading it on a plane back home, and how could something as harmless as a yoga practice and meditation class, or something as civilized and refined as a university education, lead to something that horrible and destructive? It really was a terrorist attack with something, with a poisonous gas. So I'm a yogi. I meditate. I'm also a scholar. So could something like this also happen to me? Right? That was just, and I think it's really an important question to ask, or to the people in my ashram or dojo or sangha, or indeed at my university. Could my students be picked up for something like that, or even myself? So the tipping points is what interests me here. Really, the moment where the moment, the disconnect that precedes extremism, the moment that precedes people going from, I have to resign from this society. And you read throughout these interviews, and it's mostly the pressure of being a salaryman, the pressure. It's of course a very different society from ours, but also it kind of it runs somehow 10 years ahead of us in terms of its economic organization and its neoliberalization and so on. So their bubble burst around 95, the time of this incident. Some of the women join the cult because they don't want to get married. So it's really the status quo, the oppressively perceived status quo of having to perform, having to become, having to obtain a job, having to do as the parents please, and so on. So the disconnect that precedes extremism. So that's where the gesture of withdrawal lies, and I think that's also why it's so important to do research on the topic. And we've often spoken about that gray zone. You mentioned it earlier as well. So we're kind of progressive thinking or disconnective thinking that is generally more leftist, aligns with radical right ideas of disengagement, and it's really scary and also really important.
Yeah, and I also think that so that the moment where withdrawal sort of tips over into extremism is often, and I think we definitely see that with Kaczynski. We also read with students or with Sürzen, is a kind of fantasy of completeness or wholeness. You talked about like putting things back in the box, and I think with Kaczynski and Sürzen read, the idea is that, well, if only we could go back to being hunter-gatherers in a sense, then everything would be okay. Yeah. So if only we could go back to like the infancy of humanity, or our personal infancy in a way, and then everything will be like whole and innocent again. But I don't think that withdrawal in that sense is a return. So I don't think that withdrawal necessarily entails nostalgia or melancholy. There can be an aspect, of course, of nostalgia. I mean, lots of people, including ourselves, were nostalgic of our pre-internet, brains and cells, etc. But I think that kind of nostalgia is only a sort of like driver behind the withdrawal. It's not the nostalgia in a sense of a fantasy of wanting to reestablish that sort of pre-internet age or whatever, a prior stage of human or personal development. I think that again has to do, I think, also with this idea of a broken promise. Like you want to go back to the world before the promise, or the world that was, the world that was promised. But of course that, as whatever thinkers like Freud or Derrida or whatever will teach you, like there is no such thing as a return. Like you never return to the original thing ever. So yeah, I think it's important to But again, I think, as Pepita said, it is part of withdrawal, right? So it's not that, Kaczynski or, as you said, in a sort of slightly sensible way, someone like Sürzen or Thoreau are anomalies when it comes to withdrawal. There is always this tendency. I think there's always this fantasy or the possibility of this fantasy of completeness or wholeness or authenticity in withdrawal. And that's also why this gray zone is so interesting. So once you engage in withdrawal or even fantasize, right, about withdrawal, you can either end up in a far right anarchist collective, far left anarchist collective, or you can become a complete Heideggerian, and retreat into the Black Forest or something like that. And I think both are possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I want to just give you both the opportunity to add in anything key about the book that you want to make sure we get in. If there's any elements of withdrawal that you think are extremely important to emphasize that we've so far missed.
I think the temporal aspect and perhaps the apathy one. I think those are often the withdrawal is thought of in terms of place, right? The cabin to withdraw into the forest, back to the land, and so on. But there's for me very much it's rarely thought of in temporal terms, but for me, it's very much about stopping, right? About learning to re-engage with the here and now, this body, this moment. Time has somehow become equated with productivity, with value. Every minute counts, right? So at least from an economic perspective, the quantity is more important in how it's spent, and more important than the quality of how it is spent. The mechanical is more important than the mindful. So I wanted to bring in Thich Nhat Hanh here. It's got a beautiful passage in the Heart of the Buddha's Teaching where he says, he kind of relays the story of he says, it's a famous story in Zen circles about a man and his horse. The horse is galloping quickly, he writes, and it appears that the man in the horse is going somewhere important. Another man standing alongside the road shouts, "Hey, where are you going?" And the first man replies, "I don't know, ask the horse." And from there he kind of says, this is basically our story. We're riding a horse, we don't know where we're going, and we can't stop. And he says, the horse is the habit energy that's very much instilled by current lived economic reality. And we basically have to find ways to stop our horse and reclaim our liberty. I really like that story. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think that's why the image of the cabin is also so interesting and so powerful. There's a little book by French literary theorist called Marielle Massé. I'm not sure if it has been translated, but in French it's called Nos Cabines, Our Cabins. And she basically explains that the cabin is not a fortress. It's not a citadel. So it's not something that's built to last in a way. It's also something that we have to build ourselves. So in that sense, there is something very creative about withdrawal. So it's not that there is a ready-made place somewhere or a ready-made future somewhere in a sense that we can withdraw into. Mm-hmm. But in that sense, it is more of a line of flight. I mean, maybe not in this sort of grandiose way that Deleuze and Guattari envision it. But there is something very creative in that sense, I think, about withdrawing. Mm-hmm. And so, if there is a sense of futurity of the future in withdrawal, again, I think it's more in the sense of a potential, potential to explore. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And not knowing what the future will bring. Even, that's, I think at some point we had a conversation about, what does it mean to resign? It's you don't resign from university because you have another job, right? It's you don't know where you're headed, and that's part of the withdrawal. Yeah.
Well, yeah. One thing I wonder as well, I mean, speaking of cabins, I mean, if you read the infamous stories about cabins, I mean, Thoreau, he would go home for dinner. Heidegger infamously would, he had this whole romantic thing, but then he would go down the pub and watch the football, right? So the dialogue between the thing that they withdrew from, either they retained it, or in Kaczynski's case, it was unavoidable. And I think it seems like if you were to exit the academy, for instance, it's almost like you have to sleep with one eye open for the rest of your life to just keep an eye on what the academy is doing. Like, is it encroaching in? I wonder if you guys feel the same way about that it's almost like once you've withdrawn, it's this sort of a little bit of suspicion from then onwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
I don't know, maybe I'm slightly more optimistic because I do think that we've been thinking a little bit about maybe a follow-up, of the book, and one possible topic that came up was this new emerging sort of academic sphere. So whether that is online or popular universities that sort of pop up everywhere now in Europe, I do think there is a possibility of there being a network of different kinds of institutions, maybe even temporary, institutions that do not necessarily, as you said, feel the need to sleep with one eye open and to have one eye on the academy. I do think that there is maybe it's the old, I don't know, like autonomous dream of the 70s, right? That you can have your free radios and your free universities, etc. I think you do see that something similar emerges, if only because there is a gigantic overproduction, right, of highly educated young people. They simply don't fit in the university anymore, and they remain interested and open-minded. So they need outlets for their intellectual production. So I'm in that sense I'm not that pessimistic. Also because, as we said many times, right, in this conversation, that for a lot of academics, the current situation is simply is untenable, right? Because it no longer aligns with the promise they were made and with the way that they view themselves or the way that they view their academic activities.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add about the book that you feel now that we've missed? Obviously, you can get the book, I imagine, from Roman and Littlefield's website and also all online bookstores. So hopefully this follow-up will happen. I'd be extremely intrigued to read about it. But yeah, is there anything you'd like to add in just here at the end?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, I think the two things that sort of when looking back at the project that emerged for us, I think we're so on the one hand, so this para-academic sphere that's emerging, that is a form of withdrawal, successful withdrawal, even if you like. And the other thing, is this so-called gray zone. I think the fact that there is not really a middle ground, but I think like a new, I don't know, political nebula that's emerging, that is neither, I think that can neither be described in sort of traditional leftist or traditional conservative or right-wing terms. And that is also often quite volatile in a way. So a lot of the thinkers that emerge in this zone seem to go in many different directions, and often, hark back to similar sources of inspiration, but then use them in radically different ways. I think that's very interesting. And what I also what was remarkable when we were teaching the class on withdrawal is that a lot of the students at the start of the class said, well, we're taking this class because we're so sick of politics, because everything has become so political, that we are looking for a way of thinking or theories that can help us to shed like a different light on things that is not like extremely politicized in a certain way. And as we said, like one of them, more, I don't know, like conceptual aspects of withdrawal is that it is a non-confrontational form of politics. It's a kind of politics that doesn't necessarily speak to engage, as in, Agamben's inoperativity or whatever, Bartleby's refusal, etc. And I think that's also important. Also, the fact that it allows for a way of thinking that doesn't turn everything into this sort of oppositional politics. And it also maybe reminds us, right, that politics isn't always politics. Like that we also engage in politics for whatever, mental health reasons or subjective reasons or religious reasons, etc. There's also a lot of religion, culture, art, even in politics itself. And I think that was one of the sort of maybe unintended things that came out of reflecting on the book and the issue of withdrawal.
Yeah, and I think what I take from the class was actually that there was a lot of confusion amongst the students, productive confusion on the differentiation between, let's say, apathy, right, an inability to act upon one's disengagement, but also on withdrawal as gesture, where they kept asking, but does it have to be politics? And what they confused, I think, and what we ended up talking about was the framing of withdrawal as a form of activism or direct action, and I think that completely misses the point, right? Apathy to me is very much a way of coping with the meanwhile, as is withdrawal. It doesn't have to, you really have to reframe how you think of what politics does to really get out of the action-reaction way of thinking about a political gesture.
Yeah, you could even say that, to continue in this way, that is a form of apathy, whereas withdrawal is often a kind of, I don't know, like visceral reaction, right? So it's a reaction to oversaturation, to being on the brink of burning out, etc. I think they withdraw because people, either they're long past apathy in a way, or they refuse to become apathic, right? But they've reached this sort of the tipping point, and they feel that they have no other choice than to leave, than to opt out in one way or another.
So there is hope, basically.
Yeah, there's hope.
There you go. I wanted to end on a hopeful note. But
at least there's the fantasy of hope, right?
I'll cut that bit out. No,
another promise.
But thank you both very much for coming on. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, James. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.